The taser clicked before the officer even asked his name. The sharp electrical snap echoed across the quiet front yard just after 9:17 p.m., the kind of ordinary suburban night when porch lights glowed warm and steady and nothing was supposed to go wrong. Yet Marcus Hale was already standing still on his own front step with one hand raised halfway in confusion and the other still holding the small black trash bag he had been about to carry down his driveway when the patrol car rolled up without warning and stopped so close its headlights washed the siding of his house in white light that didn't belong there. "Hands where I can see them," the officer shouted again, louder this time, like the neighborhood itself needed to hear it. And Marcus blinked once, slow and deliberate. Not because he didn't understand the command, but because he was trying to understand why it was being given at all, while the small circular ring camera mounted beside his door glowed with its faint blue halo, silently recording every word and every movement unfolding on the narrow concrete porch he had swept clean less than an hour earlier. The officer stepped forward fast, boots crunching against the gravel edge of the walkway, one hand already resting near his belt while the other pointed toward Marcus, as if he were looking at a stranger instead of a homeowner standing 3 feet from his own mailbox with his last name clearly printed in black block letters across the front. Yet the officer's voice carried the certainty of someone who believed he was in control of the moment, and Marcus's voice, when it came, stayed calm in a way that didn't match the tension building in the air as he said quietly, "Officer, I think you're at the wrong house." That should have been the end of it. Instead, the officer moved closer. The porch light flickered slightly in the breeze. Somewhere across the street, a screen door opened. A dog barked once, and then stopped as if even it sensed something was shifting that shouldn't be shifting at all. "Step forward slowly," the officer ordered, ignoring the mailbox, ignoring the address numbers glowing beside the doorframe, ignoring the fact that Marcus hadn't taken a single step toward him, and Marcus hesitated just long enough to glance toward the camera beside his shoulder before he answered, "You're being recorded right now, not as a threat, but as a reminder. The kind of reminder people give when they still believe misunderstandings can be corrected before they turn into something permanent." The officer didn't look at the camera. He didn't look at the address numbers either. Instead, he spoke again, sharper this time, repeating the same command as if repetition alone could make the moment make sense. And Marcus slowly set the trash bag down on the porch beside his shoe because something about the officer's posture told him this wasn't going to resolve itself as quickly as it should have, even though nothing about the scene matched what the officer seemed to think he was seeing. Another porch light came on down the block. A curtain shifted in a neighbor's window. The ring camera's blue circle stayed steady. Marcus lifted his hands a little higher, calm but deliberate, and said one sentence that sounded ordinary to anyone listening from across the street, but landed differently in the silence between him and the officer standing 3 steps away. "You really need to check that address again." The officer didn't move, and the camera beside the door kept recording one small detail neither of them had noticed yet. The officer's flashlight shifted slightly as if the beam itself had begun to doubt what it was illuminating, sliding across the white siding, the front steps, and finally the black metal mailbox mounted beside the door where the name Hale stood clear and centered in reflective letters that had been there for years without anyone ever questioning who lived inside this house until tonight. Yet the officer did not look at it, and instead spoke again with the same sharp certainty as before, saying he had received a call about a suspicious individual matching Marcus's description standing outside a residence that did not belong to him. And for a brief second the sentence seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, because Marcus did not move and did not argue and did not step backward into the safety of his doorway, even though he easily could have. He only turned his head slightly toward the camera beside him again, as if confirming it was still recording before answering in the same steady voice he had used from the beginning, saying quietly that this was his residence and that he had lived there for 8 years, a fact that should have ended the misunderstanding immediately, except the officer's posture did not change, and the patrol car engine continued running behind him like a reminder that this encounter had not arrived by accident. A second porch light turned on across the street, and a neighbor stepped halfway onto her walkway, holding her phone in both hands the way people do when they are not sure whether they should step closer or stay exactly where they are. And somewhere farther down the block, another door opened just enough for someone to watch from behind the frame while Marcus slowly lifted one hand toward the house number mounted beside the doorframe, careful not to make any sudden movement that could be misunderstood, and said again that the address was clearly visible right beside him if the officer wanted to verify it. But the officer did not step forward to check and instead repeated that Marcus matched the description he had been given, which only made the moment feel stranger, because descriptions are supposed to lead officers to the correct place, not the wrong porch of the correct homeowner. Marcus glanced once toward the street where another neighbor had begun recording from the sidewalk, and then looked back at the officer and spoke more carefully this time, saying that there was likely a mistake in the dispatch information and suggesting that the officer confirm the address through his radio before the situation became more complicated than it needed to be. And for the first time, there was a small pause before the officer answered, as if he had not expected the conversation to remain this calm or this precise. Yet instead of checking the information, he shifted his stance again and asked Marcus why he had been standing outside rather than inside his house, which made Marcus look down briefly at the trash bag resting beside his shoe before answering that he had stepped out less than a minute earlier to take it to the curb like he did every Wednesday night, without thinking twice about whether anyone would question him for doing something that ordinary on his own property. The Ring camera's blue light remained steady beside his shoulder, and somewhere behind the officer a second patrol vehicle turned slowly onto the street at the far corner, though it had not reached the house yet, and Marcus noticed it before the officer did. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, now not louder, but firmer, as he said that this entire interaction was being recorded from multiple angles, and that he believed it would be best for everyone involved if the address was verified immediately. And that was the moment the officer finally glanced toward the camera for the first time before looking back at Marcus with a narrowing expression that suggested he had just realized something important but had not yet decided what it meant. The second patrol vehicle did not arrive with sirens or urgency, but with something quieter and more unsettling than noise. The slow, deliberate roll of headlights turning onto the street, as if the night itself had begun paying attention to what was happening on Marcus Hale's front porch. And Marcus noticed it first, because years earlier he had learned that the direction of a second cruiser often meant a situation was already being interpreted in a way that could become harder to correct once assumptions settled into place. Yet he did not move and did not step backward and did not lower his hands as the officer in front of him shifted slightly to glance over his shoulder toward the approaching vehicle before returning his attention to Marcus with a look that carried more caution than certainty now that the camera beside the door had become impossible to ignore. Across the street, the neighbor holding her phone stepped closer to the sidewalk, not onto the lawn, but close enough that the glow of her screen reflected faintly across the parked patrol car. And another voice from farther down the block asked what was happening in a tone that was not confrontational, but concerned in the way neighbors speak when they recognize something unfolding that does not belong in their neighborhood rhythm. And Marcus remained exactly where he was standing because he understood something important that the officer did not yet seem to understand, which was that every additional witness quietly changed the shape of the moment even before anyone spoke another word. The second patrol vehicle slowed near the curb, but did not stop directly in front of the house at first, instead pausing halfway down the block, as if the driver was waiting to understand the situation before stepping into it. And Marcus looked briefly toward the mailbox again, and then back toward the officer, and said carefully that if dispatch had given the wrong address, it could still be corrected quickly and calmly before anyone involved made assumptions that would be harder to explain later. And the officer's jaw tightened slightly at that sentence because it sounded less like a suggestion now and more like a warning spoken by someone who understood procedures from the inside rather than from across the porch. A man 2 houses down stepped onto his driveway, holding his phone at chest height while pretending to check something on the screen, even though the camera lens was clearly pointed toward the front steps, and the faint hum of the second patrol vehicle's engine settled into the background like a clock counting seconds no one had planned for earlier that evening. And Marcus shifted his weight slightly, but kept his hands visible as he spoke again in a tone that remained calm, yet carried a quiet authority that had not been there at the beginning of the encounter, when everything still felt like a simple misunderstanding that could be corrected with a single address check. He said that this house had been in his name since the year he left county service, and that several officers in the department would recognize him if the officer wanted confirmation. And for the first time, the words county service seemed to pause the officer's response before it formed because they did not fit the description he believed he had been given earlier over the radio. Yet instead of asking what Marcus meant, he glanced once more toward the camera beside the door and then toward the second patrol vehicle, which had finally begun moving slowly closer to the curb directly across from the house. The porch light remained steady and the blue halo of the camera did not flicker, and somewhere behind the officer a neighbor's voice said softly that this was Marcus's house and had been for years, and Marcus lowered his hands slightly, but did not drop them entirely, as he spoke one sentence more clearly than anything he had said so far that night, saying that there was a reason he recognized exactly how this situation was supposed to be handled and that the officer might want to listen carefully before deciding what happened next. "You really want to slow this down right now," Marcus said, and the sentence did not sound like a plea or an argument, but something closer to a quiet instruction, the kind given by someone who had spent years watching moments like this go wrong when they moved too fast for anyone to correct them, and the officer's expression shifted again, not fully, not enough to change his stance, but just enough that the certainty he had arrived with no longer sat as firmly in his voice when he responded by asking what exactly Marcus meant by that. And for a brief second the entire scene seemed to pause around that question, as if even the air between them was waiting to hear the answer. Marcus lowered his hands a few inches more, still visible, still controlled, and turned his head slightly toward the street where the second patrol vehicle had now come to a complete stop with its headlights angled across the front yard. And then he looked back at the officer standing 3 steps away and said calmly that the way this interaction was unfolding did not match protocol for a simple address verification, especially not with a homeowner who had already identified himself and pointed out visible proof of residence. And that alone should have triggered a different response before escalation ever became part of the equation. The word protocol landed differently than anything else he had said so far, and the officer's posture stiffened in a way that suggested he recognized it not as a complaint, but as language used inside briefings and reports, the kind of language that did not come from someone unfamiliar with how these encounters were supposed to be handled. And across the street the neighbor, holding her phone, took another step forward, while another voice quietly said that this did not look right. Not here, not on this street where everyone knew each other well enough to notice when something did not fit. Marcus did not raise his voice and did not step forward. He only spoke again with the same steady tone, saying that he had spent 12 years working within the same county system the officer represented, that he had stood on the other side of encounters just like this one, and that there were specific steps every officer was trained to follow before making assumptions about who belonged where. And for the first time since the patrol car had arrived, the officer did not interrupt him immediately, did not repeat a command, did not advance another step, because the sentence had introduced something new into the moment that could not be dismissed as easily as everything before it. A second officer stepped out of the patrol vehicle across the street, but did not approach right away, instead standing beside the open door as if assessing the situation from a distance. And Marcus noticed him without turning his head fully, the same way he had noticed the cruiser earlier, and continued speaking in a voice that remained calm, but now carried a quiet authority that made the words feel heavier than their volume, saying that if the officer checked dispatch again, he would find that the reported address did not match this location, and that continuing without verifying that detail would create a record that would not align with what the camera beside his door was already capturing in real time. The Ring camera's blue halo reflected faintly against the wall, and the porch light above them hummed softly, as if the house itself had become part of the moment, and the officer's gaze flicked once more toward the camera, and then toward the mailbox, and then back to Marcus, as if each detail was beginning to rearrange itself into a picture he had not expected to see when he first stepped out of his vehicle minutes earlier. Marcus took a slow breath, and then said one more sentence, more deliberate than anything he had said so far, not louder but clearer, saying that he knew exactly how this was supposed to be written up afterward because he had written reports like this himself, and that the difference between a corrected mistake and a documented violation often came down to what an officer chose to do in the next few seconds. And that was the moment when the second officer across the street finally began walking toward them, and the first officer realized that whatever this situation was, it was no longer as simple as it had seemed when he first arrived. The second officer's footsteps were slower than expected, not rushed, not urgent, but measured in a way that suggested he was already reading the scene before stepping fully into it. And as he approached the edge of the driveway, his eyes moved from Marcus to the first officer, then briefly to the Ring camera mounted beside the door, and finally to the mailbox where the name Hale remained clearly visible under the porch light that had not flickered once since this began. And for a moment no one spoke, because the presence of another uniform changed the balance of the interaction in a way that could not be undone once it settled into place. "What have we got?" the second officer asked, his tone neutral but carrying the quiet weight of someone who expected an answer that made sense. And the first officer hesitated just long enough for that pause to be noticeable before replying that he had received a dispatch call about a suspicious individual outside a residence, and that Marcus matched the description provided. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes flicked once more toward the mailbox, and then back toward Marcus, as if the explanation no longer aligned as cleanly as it had a few minutes earlier. Marcus remained still, his hands now lowered but open and visible, and he spoke before the silence stretched too far, addressing the second officer directly in the same calm tone he had maintained from the beginning, explaining that there appeared to be a mismatch in the address given by dispatch, and that he had already requested verification because this was his home and had been for years. And the second officer listened without interruption, his gaze shifting briefly toward the house number mounted beside the door, and then back to Marcus with a slight narrowing that suggested he was beginning to piece together something that did not fit the initial report. Across the street, more phones were visible now, small glowing rectangles held at chest level or just above eye line, not aggressively, not intrusively, but present enough that the quiet understanding of being observed had settled fully into the space between all three men, and the Ring camera continued to record without blinking, its steady light now reflecting faintly on the officer's shoulder as he shifted his stance. "Dispatch gave you this address?" the second officer asked, turning slightly toward his partner, and the first officer answered with a short nod before reaching toward his radio, as if the suggestion Marcus had made earlier had finally found its way into the moment. And there was a brief crackle of static followed by a request for confirmation that sounded routine but carried a weight that had not been there before, because now it was no longer just about a call. It was about whether the foundation of this entire encounter was correct at all. Marcus exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recognition that the situation had reached a point where facts might finally begin to matter more than assumptions. And he spoke again, this time adding a detail he had held back until now, saying that he had served as a deputy in the same county for over a decade, and that he understood exactly how dispatch errors could happen, but also how quickly they were supposed to be corrected once identified. And the second officer's expression shifted slightly. At that, not surprise, not disbelief, but a subtle recalibration, as if Marcus had just moved from being part of the problem to part of the explanation. The radio responded with a voice that was partially obscured by static, repeating an address that did not match the numbers mounted beside Marcus's door, and for a brief second the sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing across the porch and into the quiet street where every neighbor was now fully aware that something had gone wrong at a level that could not be ignored. And the first officer's posture changed almost imperceptibly, the rigid certainty softening into something less defined as he lowered the radio slightly and glanced again at the house number, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Marcus did not step forward and did not raise his voice. He only said one more sentence, steady and precise, saying that mistakes happen, but what mattered now was how they were handled moving forward. And the second officer looked between them both before speaking again, this time more directly, saying that they needed to sort this out immediately. And as he took another step closer toward the porch, the first officer realized that whatever control he thought he had at the beginning of this encounter had already started to slip away, and the camera beside the door had captured every second of it. The radio's static faded, but the silence that followed felt louder than anything that had come before it, stretching across the porch, across the street, across every set of eyes now fixed on the front of Marcus Hale's home, as if the entire neighborhood had collectively realized that something had shifted and could not be shifted back. And the first officer stood there for a moment longer than necessary with the radio still in his hand, as if he had not yet decided what to do with the information he had just received. Because the address that came through dispatch did not match the one illuminated beside the door, and that single detail had quietly unraveled the certainty he had been standing on since the beginning of the encounter. The second officer exhaled slowly and stepped closer to the base of the porch, his posture less rigid now but more focused, and asked again in a measured tone for clarification, this time directing the question toward both the radio and the scene in front of him, as if aligning the two had become his immediate priority, and Marcus watched him without moving, recognizing the shift in approach the same way he had recognized countless similar moments years earlier when a situation began correcting itself, not through confrontation but through acknowledgement of a simple fact that should have been checked from the start. That address does not line up, the second officer said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough that everyone nearby heard it, and the words carried across the lawn where a neighbor had now stepped fully onto the sidewalk, phone raised but steady, not shaking, not reacting, just recording, and the porch light above Marcus remained constant, casting the same warm glow over a scene that no longer felt routine to anyone standing within it. The first officer finally lowered the radio, his grip loosening slightly, and glanced again at the house number, as if confirming something that had already been confirmed but had not yet been accepted, and for the first time since he arrived his voice came out differently when he spoke, not as sharp, not as certain, asking Marcus to confirm his name and residence, and Marcus answered without hesitation, stating both clearly, then adding that his identification was inside the house, and that he could retrieve it if asked properly, the phrasing intentional, careful, not confrontational, but precise in a way that suggested he understood the difference between a request and a command in situations like this. The second officer nodded once, acknowledging the statement, and then turned slightly toward his partner, his expression now carrying a quiet expectation rather than support, and the pause between them said more than any words could have, because it revealed that the situation was no longer being driven by assumption alone, but by the need to correct what had already begun unfolding incorrectly. A faint notification sound came from across the street as one of the neighbors' phones signaled something uploading or syncing, and Marcus's eyes shifted briefly in that direction before returning to the officers, and he spoke again with the same steady tone, saying that the camera beside his door automatically backed up footage to a secure cloud system and that multiple devices were already capturing the interaction from different angles, not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact that hung in the air longer than it should have because of what it implied about everything that had already taken place. The second officer's gaze moved toward the camera again, then toward the surrounding houses, then back to Marcus, and something in his posture adjusted slightly, as if he had just understood the full scope of what had been recorded up to this point, and he spoke quietly but firmly, saying that they needed to de-escalate and verify all details before taking any further action, and the first officer did not immediately respond, his silence now carrying a different weight than before because it no longer represented control but hesitation. Marcus remained where he was, shoulders relaxed but posture steady, and he said one final sentence in that moment, calm and deliberate, saying that what mattered now was not how the situation started, but how it would be documented when it ended. And as those words settled into the space between them, the first officer realized that whatever had been captured so far was no longer just an interaction on a quiet street, but something that would follow him long after the night was over. The word de-escalate hung in the air longer than it should have, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had arrived too late in a moment that had already been captured from too many angles to be undone, and the second officer stood at the base of the porch with his hands relaxed at his sides, not reaching, not signaling, simply holding position in a way that suggested control without force, while the first officer remained one step higher, closer to Marcus, but no longer in the same posture he had taken when he first approached, the edge of certainty now replaced by something quieter, something more cautious that had begun the moment the radio confirmed what Marcus had been saying all along. Across the street, the glow of phone screens had multiplied, not dramatically, not like a crowd gathering, but enough that the small, steady presence of witnesses had become undeniable, and the faint hum of recording devices blended with the low idle of the patrol vehicles in a way that made the entire scene feel documented rather than unfolding. as if it had already transitioned from a real-time encounter into something that would be replayed later from multiple perspectives, each one preserving details that no one present could afford to ignore. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, but did not step forward or backward, maintaining the same calm posture that had defined his presence from the beginning, and he spoke again with measured clarity, saying that he appreciated the second officer's approach and that verifying the situation properly would resolve everything without further confusion. And the second officer gave a small nod in response, not exaggerated, not performative, just enough to acknowledge that the direction of the interaction had changed. The first officer finally exhaled, a subtle release that might have gone unnoticed earlier, but now carried weight because it marked the first visible sign that he was recalibrating his position within the situation. And he spoke again, this time addressing Marcus directly, asking for confirmation of his full name and whether he had any form of identification inside the residence. And Marcus answered without hesitation, repeating his name clearly and stating that his identification was just inside the entryway, exactly where it had been when he stepped out less than 10 minutes earlier to take out the trash, a simple action that had somehow unfolded into something far more complicated than it should have been. The second officer glanced briefly toward the door, then back at Marcus, and said that retrieving identification would be appropriate at this stage, his tone even and procedural, and Marcus nodded once before adding that he would move slowly and narrate each step before doing so, a detail that did not come from fear, but from experience, the kind that understood how easily movements could be misinterpreted when clarity was not maintained. The first officer stepped back half a pace, not dramatically, just enough to create space. And for the first time since he arrived, the distance between him and Marcus felt intentional rather than imposed, and the shift was small, but significant because it signaled that the situation was no longer escalating but attempting to correct itself in real time. Marcus turned slightly toward the door, pausing just long enough to ensure both officers were watching and aware, then reached toward the handle with deliberate control, and the ring camera remained fixed on the entire sequence, its steady blue light reflecting the consistency of its recording as if marking each second with equal importance regardless of how the moment had begun. The door opened slowly, revealing the dim interior of the house, and Marcus stepped just inside the threshold without fully disappearing from view, his movements visible, his hands still clear, and as he reached toward a small table near the entryway, the second officer's radio crackled again softly in the background, a brief transmission that was not fully audible but carried enough clarity to confirm that the initial call had been redirected to a different address entirely, several houses down, a detail that settled into the moment with quiet finality. Marcus returned to the doorway holding his identification, extending it forward in a controlled, non-confrontational motion, and the second officer stepped up to receive it while the first officer remained still, watching, processing, and in that silent space between them all, the reality of what had just unfolded began to take shape not as an assumption, not as a misunderstanding, but as something that had been fully captured, fully documented, and impossible to reinterpret once the footage was seen. The identification card did not change hands with urgency. It moved slowly, deliberately, from Marcus's fingers to the second officer's grip, as if both men understood that this small exchange now carried more weight than anything that had happened earlier, and the second officer glanced down at it only briefly before lifting his eyes back toward Marcus, then toward the first officer, and finally toward the house itself as if confirming that every detail now aligned in a way that it should have. From the very beginning, the name matched, the address matched, the timeline matched, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any raised voice could have been because it left no space for reinterpretation, no room for confusion, only the quiet realization that the situation had been built on something that should have been checked long before it reached this point. The first officer remained still, his posture no longer rigid but not fully relaxed either, caught somewhere between acknowledgement and hesitation, and he finally spoke, his voice lower now, asking Marcus how long he had lived at the residence, a question that sounded procedural on the surface but carried something else underneath, something closer to recognition that the conversation had shifted from suspicion to verification. Marcus answered calmly, stating the number of years without emphasis, without exaggeration, just fact, and the second officer nodded slightly, as if that confirmation aligned with everything else he had already observed, then handed the identification card back with a careful motion that mirrored the way it had been received. Across the street, the faint movement of phones lowering and raising again suggested that the people watching understood something had changed even if they did not know every detail. And the quiet murmur of voices carried across the lawn in soft fragments, not accusatory, not loud, but present enough to reinforce that this moment no longer belonged only to the three men standing on the porch. The Ring camera continued recording without interruption, its steady blue light now reflecting against the officer's sleeve as he shifted slightly, and Marcus glanced toward it for a brief second before returning his focus to the officers, not because he needed to confirm it was still there, but because he understood exactly what it meant now that everything had been documented from the very first second. The second officer spoke again, this time more directly, saying that there had been a dispatch error and that the original call had been reassigned to a different location, and the statement was delivered calmly, but with enough clarity that it settled into the scene as a final piece of information rather than a suggestion. And for a moment no one responded because the explanation itself confirmed what had already become obvious to everyone present. The first officer finally exhaled again, longer this time, and his gaze dropped briefly toward the ground before lifting back toward Marcus. And there was a pause there, not long, but long enough to feel intentional, as if he was considering what needed to be said next and how it would sound not just in this moment but later, when everything that had been recorded would be reviewed in full. Marcus did not speak immediately. He did not press the moment. He simply stood there with the same composed posture he had held from the beginning, allowing the silence to exist without filling it. And that silence carried its own weight because it placed the next step entirely in the hands of the officers. The second officer glanced once more toward his partner, then back toward Marcus, and said that they would be clearing the scene, his tone steady and procedural. But the words themselves did not resolve everything because the presence of the camera, the witnesses, and the documented sequence of events meant that what had happened would not end simply because the officers chose to leave. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the statement, and then spoke quietly, saying that he understood mistakes could happen, but that this moment would not disappear just because it was over. And as those words settled into the space between them, the first officer realized that the conclusion of this encounter was not the end of the story. It was only the point where something much larger had just begun. The patrol cars did not leave immediately, and that hesitation lingered in the air like the final note of something unfinished. Because even though the second officer had already stated they would be clearing the scene, both men remained where they were for a few seconds longer than necessary, as if they understood that driving away would not erase what had just been recorded from beginning to end. And Marcus stood quietly on his porch, no longer holding his identification, no longer explaining anything, simply present in the same space where everything had unfolded, his posture unchanged, his expression calm but no longer neutral, carrying a quiet awareness that the moment had already moved beyond the street and into something far larger. The first officer finally stepped back toward the driveway, his movements slower now, less defined, and as he reached the edge of the porch he glanced once more toward the camera beside the door, not directly, not fully, but enough to acknowledge that it had been there the entire time, capturing every word, every pause, every shift in tone that had taken place under the porch light. And the second officer turned as well, walking back toward the cruiser with a steady pace that did not rush but did not linger either, his role in the correction complete, even if the situation itself was not resolved in any meaningful way beyond the immediate moment. Across the street, the neighbors began lowering their phones slightly, not all at once, not in unison, but gradually, as if the absence of further escalation signaled that the scene was ending even though the weight of it remained. And a quiet murmur moved through the small group of onlookers, not loud enough to interrupt anything, but enough to confirm that everyone present understood that what they had witnessed was not ordinary, not routine, not something that would be forgotten by morning. Marcus watched as the first officer reached the patrol car door, paused for a brief second, then opened it and sat inside. And for a moment the engine idled without movement, the headlights still casting long shadows across the front yard before the vehicle finally began to roll slowly away from the curb, followed shortly by the second cruiser, both leaving the street the same way they had entered. Except now the silence behind them felt different, heavier, as if the space they left behind held more than just the absence of their presence. The porch light continued to glow, unchanged, and the Ring camera remained fixed in place, its blue halo steady, recording the final seconds of an encounter that had already been preserved in full. And Marcus turned slightly toward the door, but did not go inside immediately, instead looking out across the street where a neighbor gave a small nod of acknowledgement, not celebratory, not relieved, but respectful in a way that recognized both what had happened and what might follow. He took a slow breath and then stepped forward, not into the house yet, but toward the edge of the porch where he had first been standing when the patrol car arrived. And for a brief moment, he looked down at the spot where the trash bag still rested untouched, a small, ordinary detail that now felt almost out of place in a night that had shifted so far beyond something simple. And then he picked it up, holding it in one hand as if grounding himself in the routine that had been interrupted, before turning back toward the door. Inside, the house remained quiet, unchanged, the same as it had been before everything began, but the world outside had already moved forward, and somewhere beyond the street, beyond the houses, beyond the immediate moment, the footage had already begun to travel, uploading, syncing, appearing on screens that were not present here but would soon carry the same images, the same voices, the same sequence of events that could not be rewritten once seen. Marcus paused once more at the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame, and for the first time since the encounter began, he allowed himself to look directly at the camera beside him, not to check it, not to confirm it was recording, but to acknowledge what it had done and what it would continue to do long after the night ended. And he spoke one final sentence, quiet but clear, not directed at the officers who had already left, not directed at the neighbors across the street, but at the truth itself as it existed in that moment, saying that the difference between power and accountability was not who showed up first, but who stayed visible when everything was over. And as he stepped inside and the door closed behind him, the camera kept recording for a few seconds longer, capturing an empty porch where something ordinary had turned into something that would not be forgotten.